James, what's been happening overnight with Chinese bombers? Who'd have thought it?
Well, who'd have thought it? Some interesting news out of the Pacific overnight. China sent a number of fighter jets over to Taiwan and did a little bit of a flyby, got their radar all upset, and Taiwan basically waved them off. But it's really interesting because we've all wondered, under a Biden presidency, what is that going to mean for us here in the Pacific? Now, the interesting thing is that I think China has two problems it's got to solve. On the one hand, they've got to show themselves as being really tough and nationalist for their domestic population. But at the same time, they actually have to try and keep things calm for a while so that they can con the Biden administration into doing some sort of a reset with China after the Trump administration years. So this, I think, was designed more for domestic consumption within China than it was to try and scare Taiwan or the Americans, because, in fact, I think at the moment China wants to try and keep things as cool as they can to get everything they can out of the Biden.
Well, Rita, speaking of China, we've long argued on this show that Australia should get out of the United Nations because apparently we're the baddies, Rita.
Iran expressed serious concern over violation of human rights and humanitarian law and war crimes committed by the Australian armed forces in the region. Iran recommends Australia the following: 1. To end impunity for perpetrators of war crimes by its military. 2. To end the policy of arbitrary detention and forceful extradition at the request of the United States on the basis of false legal grounds.
Of course, that was Iran, one of the bastions of human rights in the world. In fact, we've had some of the world's biggest human rights abusers this week criticise Australia's record. We've had China, North Korea, and you saw there Iran at the UN be critical of Australia's record on race relations, on systematic police brutality and the treatment of minorities. Now, these are countries that are engaged in just horrendous behaviours, whether you're talking about China and the ethnic genocide of the Uyghurs, the fact that political dissidents are locked up and killed, or Iran, where they shoot dead 1,500 protesters in the street and lock up women who protest hijab laws. They are sitting at the UN criticising Australia, and we're paying for the pleasure of being there. I mean, are we crazy?
But, James, it's not only our human rights where apparently we don't come up to scratch either. Apparently climate change, we're the baddies as well. James.
Insightful piece, I think, in the Australian over the weekend, in which he's pointed out that now that the Biden administration has come in with very tough targets and a very big, basically Green New Deal agenda, we're going to be forced, or at least going to be put under an awful lot of pressure to join up to a lot of these sorts of things, including a 2050 carbon neutral target, as well as pushes for electric vehicle mandates, phasing out internal combustion engines and all of the like. So it's a really tough political and economic problem for us because, number one, they want to make the electricity supply less reliable and yet force people to be more dependent on electricity for their vehicles. That's one thing. But then it also creates a big problem for Scott Morrison going forward, because does he go into his next election then having this whole big thing hanging around him that he then has to take to the Australian people, which, of course, taking these sorts of things to Australia has been a big disaster for so many leaders in the past. We've seen so many governments founder on these climate change targets. So Scott Morrison has a really big problem here. As Keating said, you change the government, you change the nation. Well, in America's case, you change the government and you change the world. And that's what we are now facing. And Scott Morrison has a big dilemma on his hands now.
He certainly does. Rita, a funny thing happened on the way to Joe Biden's inauguration. It appears that the coronavirus has mysteriously become a little less of a problem to all those Democrat mayors and others. Why would that be, Rita?
Well, it is quite astonishing, the timing of this. Some of the most ardent lockdown enthusiasts, we're talking about Democratic mayors and governors from New York to Chicago to Michigan, are all coming out now and saying, we can't have these lockdowns. We've got to reopen our restaurants. And they're all announcing reopenings. They're saying this isn't sustainable. It is so destructive. Hello? Anyone who said that a couple of weeks ago was accused of being a granny killer. But now that's what we are hearing. And then nothing's really substantially changed, particularly in places like New York and DC and Michigan. But they're reopening. And I think the economic boost will be very welcome by the Biden administration.